title of the article is The McGeer Brothers, the Accidental Immigrants. In April 1930, my grandfather, Joseph McGeer, went to an orphanage, probably in Grant Street, Philadelphia, where my father, Joseph, aged 4, and his brother, Lenny, aged 2, were living, and put them on a ship in New York bound for Glasgow. They travelled for 12 days unaccompanied on the SS California. A letter was sent to their aunt, Mrs. Margaret Heffernan, from the shipping line informing her of the necessary paperwork which would be required for my father and uncle to be allowed to emigrate to Scotland. This letter stated that Margaret would have to demonstrate that she had the means and ability to take care of these, and I quote, American-born children. The letter suggested that her ability be certified by her local minister and her means by another, and I quote again, gentleman. This unusual turn of events resulted from a car accident in Philadelphia in 1929. The circumstances are not clear, but it resulted in the death of my grandmother, Catherine McGurk, who had emigrated to the USA in 1923 at the age of 18, along with an older sister, Hannah, aged 22. Hannah was also involved in the accident and subsequently returned to Port Glasgow. Catherine and Joseph had lived in Philadelphia before the accident, and they had boarders, as had my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, who also lived in Philadelphia, with all 13 of their boarders. On my father's death certificate, my grandfather's occupation was given as general labourer. However, this is likely to be a dated description. According to the 1920 census, both my great-grandparents were still alive, but by the 1930 census, my grandfather was living as a boarder with another family, and my great-grandparents could not be traced. This may partly explain why my father and uncle were in an orphanage and the need to send the boys to Scotland. My grandfather was born in Philadelphia in 1905. He was the son of John and Susan McGeer, whose maiden name was McBride. John was born in 1871 and Susan in 1873 in Pennsylvania. The 1900 census showed Joseph to have an elder sister, Teresa, born in 1895. Also living with John and Susan were 3 other people, James McBride, Patrick McBride and Miles McBride. This may indicate that Susan had been previously married and had 3 children by her first husband, but her age makes it more likely that these boys may have been Susan's brothers or nephews. Of John and Susan's own parents, 3 were born in Ireland and 1 in England. Their ages make it likely that they arrived in the USA around the time of the potato famine in the 1840s. According to family stories, the Depression of the 1930s had hit the family hard, hence the decision to send the boys to live with my grandmother's sister, Margaret, who lived in Port Glasgow and had no children of her own. Judging by the clothes in a photograph around that time, the new family appears relatively comfortable in a town suffering badly during the Depression. Again, family stories told of a small football pool's win, which did not transform their lives, but appears to have insulated them from the worst effects of mass unemployment. However, this may have taken place at a later date, but personal experience supports the idea of an enhanced income compared to neighbours. Margaret had been married to Peter Heffernan, who had fought in the Great War and died of his wounds, probably gas inhalation, in the 1920s. Margaret married John McGee in the late 1930s. They lived at 3 Victoria Street in Port Glasgow with the 2 boys. When my father got married to my mother, Letitia Devlin, in 1950, they moved into a house in George Street, across the backyard from Margaret and John, and my sister and I were born there. It is interesting to note that around the backyard that enclosed Victoria Street, Bay Street and George Street lived my maternal grandmother and 2 uncles. The house was very small indeed, consisting of a small kitchen and bedroom as well as a cramped living room. It had no electricity, and the communal toilet, shared with another family, was about 60 yards away across an open balcony. It was a long, dark, cold run for a small boy on a winter's night. My father and uncle were not adopted by their aunt and uncle, and indeed my grandfather made several attempts to have his boys returned to the USA. In 1934, he even sent 2 tickets to Margaret asking that the boys be placed on a named ship, but both boys, particularly Lenny, were so upset that they were not sent. Apparently the plan had been that the boys would then return when they left school, but the advent of World War II made this impossible. In 1931, my grandfather married Catherine McGlinchey, who was then aged 32, 6 years older than my grandfather. Catherine was born in Ireland and had emigrated to the USA, leaving from Liverpool and passing through Ellis Island in New York in 1921. It is likely that her family had moved to Liverpool before her emigration to the USA. It's likely since in 1959, when Catherine and my grandfather visited Scotland, they spent 5 days in Liverpool visiting her relatives. They set up home at 4135 Levick Street in Philadelphia and had 2 daughters. I do not know their names, but have their college graduation photographs. These photographs were taken in the 1950s and would indicate that the family had prospered. My father and uncle never visited the USA, but Joseph and Catherine did come to Scotland in 1959. It was the only time my grandfather saw his sons after 1930. Correspondence between father and sons does not seem to have been regular, with Lenny and Catherine most often in touch, as can be seen in a letter from Catherine sent to Len in 1970, informing him of the death of his father. I met them in 1959, but do not have any clear memories, apart from the fact that it was the only time I ever saw my father cry. I do recall being given money at the airport in Renfrew by Catherine as they left. An 8-year-old boy remembers the day he was given a year's pocket money in one day. My father and Lenny both retained their US citizenship until they died, which had a few unintended consequences. In 1946, my father was called up for national service in Britain and ended up in the Black Watch, based in Perth. He recalled his basic training and subsequent entry into the Army Catering Corps, which he disliked almost as much as the bagpiper, who woke them at 5 a.m. every day. 1 week into his catering career, he received a letter discharging him because he was an alien. He was required to renew his US citizenship every 3 years, and did so at the US Consulate in Edinburgh. On these occasions, he also confirmed me and my young sister as US citizens until 1968. My younger brother wasn't born until 1969. This time, he was informed that if he did so again, I would be liable for national service in the USA. My father did not fancy me being sent to Vietnam, so my sister and I became British in 1968. My father worked as a welder in the marine engine maker Kincaid's in Greenock virtually all his life and died in 1982 from a heart condition. Lenny worked in the ropeworks in Port Glasgow and never married. He died in 1997 from cancer, aged 70. He had latterly been one of my sister's patients since she was then a district nurse. Both my father and uncle had been keen cyclists, with Lenny involved in cycling tours of Europe in the 1950s, and he was still cycling months before he died. However, there was one final twist to this relatively sad story. I say sad, but the boys lived happily with Margaret and John and regarded them as their parents. Lenny was in Inverclyde Royal in Greenock in the weeks before he died. I visited regularly and remember asking if he wished any books or newspapers. I must have pushed the offer a bit too much, since he finally said to me that he could not read or write. He had been born with a speech impediment and largely sidelined at school, and as a result never learned. He kept this secret so well that few people, even in the family, ever knew. As I was a teacher, it was particularly poignant. The family connection to the USA has, however, continued. My wife, Eileen, and I have 3 sons, Ewan, Paul and Alan, who are all scientists. Paul is a geologist and married to Alicia, who is from the United States, whom he met while they were both studying in New Zealand. They have a son, Darian, who currently holds both a British and US passport, and all 3 now live in Houston, Texas.